Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining. I think I can hand it over to Maureen at the start to give some welcome remarks, if that's okay.
That's okay, Yamina. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. So, dear friends, advocates, and our changemakers, welcome to the 9th edition of the Global Days of Action on Tax Justice for Women's Rights, or as we like to call it, the GDOA. The Global Days of Action on Tax Justice for Women's Rights is an initiative of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice with its regional networks, Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia, Tax Justice Network Africa, Tax Justice Europe, Rede Justicia Fiscal, Fact Coalition, and Canadians for Tax Fairness, as well as the members of GAJ's Tax and Gender Working Group. As we come together from across the world, we unite in a shared mission to demand tax justice that advances gender equality, values care as a public good and a human right, and ensures a fair distribution of resources to build a more just and inclusive society. For too long, women, especially those in the global south, have shouldered the burden of unpaid and underpaid care work, filling the gaps left by austerity measures, privatization, and unjust tax policies. Public care services remain underfunded, regressive tax systems disproportionately burden low-income communities, and corporations and the wealthy continue to benefit from an economic system that deepens inequality. This must change, and together we will make it happen. This year's Global Days of Action is more than a campaign. It is a call to action. As we mark the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration, the 4th Financing for Development Conference, and the start of the intergovernmental negotiations for a UN tax convention, we have a critical opportunity to shape global policies that will define the future of tax justice, gender equality, and economic fairness. Our objectives for the 2024 Global Days of Action: 1, to raise awareness of the connection between progressive taxation, gender equality, and rebuilding the social organization of care. 2, mobilize global advocacy to ensure gender transformative provisions are included in the UN Tax Convention. 3, strengthen alliances between feminist movements, tax justice organizations, and trade unions to push policymakers towards action. 4, influence national, regional, and international policies to promote tax justice for women's rights. Our key campaign demands are: 1, progressive taxation for a gender transformative social organization of care. We call for tax policies that ensure the wealthiest individuals and corporations contribute their fair share, creating the fiscal space needed to fund essential public care services such as childcare, elder care, healthcare, and social protection. At the same time, we call for the repeal of regressive tax policies that disproportionately harm women and marginalized communities. 2, gender transformative provisions in the UN Tax Convention. We demand that the UN Tax Convention explicitly integrates gender equality considerations into all the relevant provisions to address structural inequalities and ensure tax justice works for women. 3, increased public investment in care services. Governments must significantly invest in public care infrastructure and services, ensuring decent wages, working conditions, and professional recognition for care workers, the majority of whom are women. Care work must be treated as essential to economic growth and social well-being. 4, recognition and valuation of unpaid care work. Unpaid care work must be integrated into national and global economic indicators. Governments must implement policies that ensure both the paid and unpaid caregivers are economically supported and protected through social protection. And 5, fair and equitable tax systems for gender equality. We call for tax reforms that ensure that those with the highest ability to pay contribute more to the public good. These funds must be directed towards gender transformative public services that meet the needs of women and marginalized communities, including universal, accessible, and affordable public care services, healthcare, and social protection. This is our moment for action. Over the coming days, We will mobilize, raise our voices, and demand a world where tax systems work for women and not against them. We will stand together with feminist movements, trade unions, and tax justice organizations to ensure that economic systems value care, prioritize gender equality, and serve the needs of all rather than the wealthiest few. This is our time to make taxes work for women and reclaim care as a human right. Together, we will not only demand change, we will drive it. Let's get to work. Back to you, Yamina.
Thank you so much, Maureen, for those welcoming remarks. And hi again, and welcome as well from my side. So my name is Yamina Ouldali, and I'm very honored to be moderating today's launch event. I work for the Gender and Development Network, GADN, which is based in the UK, and we're also a part of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice's Tax and Gender Working Group, as Maureen mentioned. To start off, just a little bit of housekeeping. So in case you haven't seen it, we do have interpretation available in English, Spanish, and French. And to access that, please click on the little globe at the bottom of your Zoom screen and then select the language that you'd like to listen to. Without further ado, I'm going to just set out briefly what the plan is for today. So we are joined by 4 representatives of GACH's regional networks for today's launch, and I will introduce them in a minute. We're then going to have a round of interventions from all of them, and you can also put questions that you might have for them in the chat and in the Q&A, so we can get back to those after the panel. But first of all, we're very pleased to be joined today as well by Magdalena Sepúlveda Carmona, who is Director of United Nations Research Institute for Social Development. And in her opening remarks, I'm going to hand over to you with the question, taking a look at this year's Global Days for Action theme, which is progressive taxation for an inclusive and just social organization for care. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that actually means and why it's relevant and important? Over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure for me to participate in the 9th edition of a Global Day of Action on tax justice for women's rights. I think that today, this year topic, it's critical. The unequal distribution of care and domestic work is one of the major obstacles for gender equality. So bringing progressive taxation and just care economy, it's very timely. But let me begin my presentation referring a little bit to what do we understand by care work. So care and domestic work encompass all the activities that support people's daily life and physical and emotional well-being. These include cooking, fetching water, cleaning the house, providing school support, supporting family members. Care is at the foundation of all our societies, and it is essential for all of us, and all of us need care during different stages of our life. Yet the unequal distribution of this care and domestic work is the major barrier for gender equality. So why? Why is this? This is the case because across the world, due to entrenched discrimination, women and girls dedicate substantially more time than men to unpaid care work. This heavy and unequal responsibility for unpaid care work is a barrier to women's greater involvement in the labor market, affecting her productivity, economic growth, and poverty reduction. The unequal distribution, intensity, and lack of recognition of unpaid care work significantly undermine the dignity of caregiver. This situation prevents them from enjoying several human rights on an equal basis than men, hinder progress toward gender equality, and reinforces the disproportionately vulnerability of women and girls to poverty throughout their lives. This unequal distribution of unpaid care work is highly reflective of the power relations between men and women. Discriminatory gender stereotype, which construe women as second-class citizens, and we're seeing this quite significantly in the news lately, whose place is in the home, really perpetuate this unequal distribution of work. Addressing care responsibility is therefore essential to ensure gender equality at home at work and in society as a whole. So it's also the unequal distribution of unpaid care and domestic work. It's not equal for all women. The amount, the intensity, and the drudgery of unpaid care work increase with poverty and social exclusion. So women and girls in poor households, of course, spend much more time in this task. Not only women living in poverty perform the lion's share of unpaid care work, but they also stay poor because they do so. So dedication to unpaid care work resulting in scarcity of time have significant financial and opportunity costs that perpetuates poverty in women. And this is very important. We also need to understand that the enjoyment of rights are different for men and women due to these care responsibilities. So the intensity of the care workload for women and girls hinder their progress in education. They prevent them to have income earning activities or even accumulate for retirement and saving and make them more poor in old age. So what is the role of the state in all this situation? Well, the state actions or inaction define who has access to quality care and who bear the cost of its provision. For example, when public services are unavailable, are low quality, or do not accommodate to the needs of parents or caregiver, the unpaid care work of families and communities is intensified. When the state fails to adequately regulate, fund, or provide care, the burden shifts to families who have to make their own arrangement. But owing to gender stereotypes, then women assume the bulk of this work. So the lack of publicly provided care solutions is at the central of the discussion that we're having here about it's one of the major obstacles to gender equality. So the main question here that it's very challenging is how countries are going to finance this care system. So of course, we need to discuss and say that countries should design, implement, and evaluate macroeconomic policies, particularly fiscal policies, from a gender equality perspective. That they should aim to mobilize the maximum available resources to increase their investment in public care system. However, the main problem that we have for developing countries is that the capacity of domestic tax system to generate the necessary revenues is hindered by an outdated international tax system. The current system allows tax avoidance by multinational and the wealthy and facilitate illicit financial flows. The current international tax framework is insufficient also for today's digital economy and fail to anticipate corporations manipulating their profit to be reported in tax haven or the wealthy using jurisdiction with high levels of financial secrecy to conceal their assets. To enable countries to mobilize more domestic resources to implement care system, we need to change this obsolete and unfair international system that exists today. So there's been several proposals. Many of them need to be taken at the same time. For example, as promoted by ICRIT, there should be an agreed global minimum tax of 25% for multinational corporations. And there should also be a fair taxation system for high net worth individuals and billionaires, which required imposing a minimum tax on the ultra-rich. Some of these changes can be implemented at the domestic level, and we have seen a good example recently in February by the French National Assembly that voted to adopt the Zuckman tax on the ultra-wealthy individual. although we anticipate that the right-leaning Senate might oppose. However, national measures are not sufficient. In a globalized world, progress required global commitment. The 21st century challenges we face today, from climate change to addressing pandemic, demand a collective action rooted in solidarity, equity, and justice. And recently, what we have seen from many powerful states is just they're taking steps in the wrong direction. For example, foreign aid that should be based or should be the reflection of this solidarity, equity, and justice is facing major budget cuts. So USAID imploded. And even Europe, who are usually major donors, are reducing their support. So this signals a funding crisis for global development. So when developing countries are confronted with high level of debt, when they are confronted with high social demands due to climate change or due to the high cost of living crisis that we're having, then where do they take the money? They need to take money through multinational corporations and the ultra-rich paying the fair share in taxes. Now, despite this current situation that it's very negative and a little bit depressing, I would say, there is still hope. And the hope has been pushed by developing countries and strongly supported by civil society organizations. And this hope, it's really through the negotiation of the Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation. So all the demands that were capitulated by the colleague at the beginning of this launch, all of them are critical in today's world to ensure not only gender equality, but also to ensure that we live in fairer and more inclusive society. Therefore, I raise my voice and add my voice to the demands that were made. I think that we must urge our government to take action in order to create a fairer global economic system. And this, of course, includes supporting progressive negotiation in the Framework Convention and demanding the necessary reform to the international financial architecture. I believe that by renewing our commitment to international tax cooperation and making our global system more inclusive and equitable, we can build a future where gender equality is not merely a rhetoric, a word, but it's a reality for all women and girls. Many thanks.
Thank you so very much, Magdalena, for those opening remarks. I think they form a great basis for our panel discussion today. And as I said, dear attendees and participants, please, if you do have questions, pop them in the chat and in the Q&A, and there will be some time at the end to come back to those. But now I'm going to turn to our esteemed panelists as well. And as I said at the beginning, I'm going to introduce each of them as they come in, and then they will be given an opportunity for a 5-minute intervention as well, with some specific questions that we're going to pose to them. So first of all, I'm going to turn to Klelia Guerrero Garcia, who is Tax Justice Specialist at Latindadd. And Klelia, please, can you tell us a little bit more about how progressive taxation policies can help address the gender disparities in caregiving responsibilities, and also touch on the role that governments should play in ensuring that care work, both paid but also unpaid, is adequately valued? Over to you, Klelia. Thank you.
Thank you, Yamina, for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm truly honored to join you as we launch this campaign. And well, these are really key and difficult questions to answer, I think. But let's start with a striking fact that Magdalena already mentioned briefly. So according to the International Labour Organization, women perform over 75% of unpaid care work worldwide. And this is different in each region, but it's an imbalance that has persisted for generations. And I think that even our generation grew up watching our mothers, aunts, sisters, and neighbors juggle studies, jobs, household, and many people around that were depending on their care. However, it's frustrating how much such a work of keeping families and therefore societies together is still largely invisible in economic calculations. So I think this space is kind of a call for us to rethink about how we are working to change that, because we are already trying to do it, right? Then progressive taxation comes to the table as it is not merely a tool for revenue collection. It's also a transformative, potentially transformative mechanism that could correct long-standing social imbalances. Our tax systems should be structured so that those with the greatest ability to contribute more to the public well-being. That is clear. But what needs to be connected here is that care systems also must be understood as a public good because they contribute largely to this public well-being. Then this means that public funds should be directed towards building universal, accessible, and affordable care services. And then consider this. Even under traditional and limited measures as the GDP, some country estimates of the contribution of unpaid care work to their functioning, they go between 10% and 25% in different countries, in different regions. And these are astonishing figures, remembering that these measures are not conceived to this kind of contributions, right? It's limited, as I think we know. So without proper recognition and funding, but mainly recognition as the first step, we cannot have a true change. We will perpetuate a system where care work is undervalued, unrecognized, and where its burdens fall almost exclusively on us women. So this brings me to a quick ad on demand 5, ensure gender equality in tax systems and public services. As from Latin America, we are kind of motivating the reflection on it. And we call for tax reforms that foster a fair and equitable system, one where those who can pay more contribute more, not only because of the basic concept of it, but also because maybe, and I'm being sarcastic here, their wealth has been based greatly on care. And also, such reforms are critical if we are to build public infrastructures that meet the needs of women and in general of the society as a whole. Because as it is now, there is discrimination in the way we understand and support different members of the society because of this social distribution of care. Therefore, progressive taxation is our pathway to a society where every caregiver is acknowledged and supported. Also, there is data from the OECD that reinforces this perspective, even though we have some asterisks there. Countries with progressive tax systems are not only more equitable, but also better positioned to invest in essential public services, including those that support care work. Governments must lead this change, breaking away from the outdated models that view care as purely private responsibility and start recognizing it as a public good. They must invest in universal care services, accessible healthcare, and robust social protection programs. When care is embedded in our economic framework, in our productive and consumption frameworks, it will not longer remain as invisible, unpaid, and recognized, and it would finally be celebrated as the indispensable element of our collective prosperity that it is. Finally, today, as we gather as within the framework of the campaign, I first of all invite all of you to envision a reality where all of these, where tax systems and public services are truly just and inclusive, having care in the center of them. And I would like to also thank you for your work to ensure that every act of care in our societies is valued as the foundation of the vibrant, resilient, and just world that we want to have. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so very much, Klelia. Those are really great remarks at the start of our panel, and also the little exercise to imagine what we want the system to be like, I think much needed in today's time. And that leads us really nicely over to our next panelist, which is Chenai Mukumba from Tax Justice Network Africa. She's the executive director there. And Chenai, if I can hand over to you with the question, what steps can we take to ensure that unpaid care work is recognized and integrated into national economic systems and global frameworks so that care workers, especially women, receive the support and social protections they deserve? Over to you.
Thanks, Yamina. Thanks so much for that question. I think it's an incredibly important one. And a huge thank you to Getty for organizing this conference so that we can unpack some of these questions. So I think it's important to note, and just to reiterate what Klelia mentioned, right, that we live in a society where the bulk of this unpaid care work is predominantly undertaken by women, right? And so this encompasses all of these activities such as child rearing, elder care, and domestic chores, right? Despite this, we find that despite the fact that it plays such a fundamental role in sustaining economies and societies, it remains very largely unrecognized, right, and excluded from formal economic metrics, right, such as GDP. And what we found is that this oversight actually perpetuates gender inequalities and hampers women's economic empowerment. So your question, right, so what are some of the steps that we can take in order to recognize and subsequently integrate unpaid care work? The first is we need to have a conversation about reforming our national accounting systems, right? So traditional economic indicators such as the GDP completely fail to account for unpaid care work, right? And really then subsequently render women's contribution as invisible, right? And so what we need to do is find a way of putting in place an accounting system that's able to take cognizance of this unpaid care work, right? And thereby acknowledge its economic significance. The second is that we really need to, and this is something that we've called for often, but we've seen very slow implementation of, and this is implement gender responsive budgeting, right? And so this really speaks to the role in which the way in which governments need to design budgets that address the distinct needs and contribution of all genders, right? Gender budgeting involves analyzing the budgetary allocations to ensure that they're promoting gender equality and supporting unpaid caregivers. And so this looks like, investing in universal childcare that can reduce the gender pay gap and enhance women's participation in labor force. And, the way in which we are raising revenues is really important to help us allocate sufficient resources to do that. Another way that we also need to be thinking about this is by investing in social infrastructure. And this is something that Klelia made reference to as well, right? So enhancing access to childcare and elder care services, right? And providing flexible working arrangements is really, really important. And I think this is something when trying to ensure that we are taking steps to integrate unpaid care work within our economies. This is something that we really need to prioritize. So I think really by way of conclusion, recognizing and subsequently integrating unpaid care work into the national economic systems and also just broader global frameworks frameworks is really, really imperative to help us achieve gender equality and economic justice broadly, right? So undertaking actions such as reforming our accounting systems. I think, like I mentioned, GDP doesn't account for this. Putting in place gender responsive budgeting so that we're very intentional about how we account for and subsequently recognize unpaid care work. And then also investing in the social infrastructure, which I mentioned Klelia had made reference to, are really some of the ways that we can do this. And this is essentially, you know, a few examples of the kind of steps that are particularly crucial for building equitable and inclusive societies across the world. Thanks, Yamina.
Thank you so very much, Chenai. It's great to hear some like concrete steps and actions that need to be taken, because I think often governments and decision makers kind of come back to us as advocates, oh, this is really unrealistic or this isn't feasible, but actually we have a concrete roadmap of what we want them to do that would really affect equitable change. So thank you so much, Chenai. Next up on the panel, we have Tove Maria Ryding, who is Policy and Advocacy Manager for Tax Justice at the European Network on Debt and Development, Eurodad. And Tove, I see here we have two big questions for you. So obviously this year we have many important multilateral spaces and moments that we can potentially use to enhance some of our calls and really push this agenda forward. So in what ways could we use the momentum of the 30th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration for Action, the UN Tax Convention negotiations that are obviously ongoing, as well as the Fourth Financing for Development Conference, to really strengthen the global movement for tax justice and women's rights? Very easy question. And then we have a second one. What are the potential challenges as well in integrating gender transformative approaches into tax policies? And how can we overcome this resistance from policymakers or also corporations who might be reluctant to adopt such reforms, even though we set them out so very clearly and they make so much sense? Over to you, Tove.
Thank you so much. And thank you also to all the other panelists for their great contributions. Yes, indeed, we live in extremely exciting times. And I think given that it's the 9th time we do the Global Alliance Days of Action, I think the first thing to say is let's look at what's already working and the progress that we're making. When the Global Alliance Tax and Gender Working Group first started working, the response when you said tax and gender was a bit from policymakers. It was like you were talking about mixing hot dogs and whipped cream. It was like, what do these things have to do with each other? And the answer, of course, was a lot. The reason why economic inequality and very much also between men and women continues to exist. One key reason for that is that our tax systems, we're supposed to make the system better, but actually, when we get it wrong, it can actually worsen inequalities. And we've made so much progress that there is now a much stronger recognition that, of course, these two are intrinsically linked, tax policies and gender inequalities. And the other thing that's working is that we went from saying we want a UN tax convention, we have to start a process to negotiate one. Now we have it. And now the question is, okay, so what should go into this UN tax convention? And that's the, I think, important backdrop on the global level, is that between now and the end of 2027, they're going to be writing a legally binding agreement that looks like this could be the most important global agreement on tax in our lifetime and in the last 100 years. So it's perfect. We've really established the link between tax and gender, and now we actually have a place where we can capture it in legally binding commitments. We also have a lot of important moments this year. Indeed, the Beijing Declaration, financing for development, and then we just learned the negotiations of the tax convention, that the first substantive session is going to start at the beginning of August this year. So building the momentum, let's look first at the ongoing negotiations of financing for development. Tax and gender is recognized in a way that is stronger than it was in the past. And we also have language in there on progressive taxation. So it's looking better, but there is still this air of, oh, yes, we will make sure that we have gender responsive tax systems. And for that purpose, we're going to develop some monitoring tools, and we're going to do some capacity building, presumably, again, of developing countries. And this is not good enough, because it really comes down to ensuring that we start taxing the rich and using that money to support public services, and also reduce the extreme tax burden on the poorest. It's political will, and that political will really, it's not just about doing a bit of capacity building and holding some meetings where you talk about tax and gender. It's really about integrating it when the big decisions are made. And there we still have a few steps to go. And we saw that when they wrote the terms of reference for the tax convention. They wrote the mandate for what this convention should deliver. It's a very, very good document. We were extremely happy about that document. It outlines that we should have an international tax system for sustainable development. It's really good language. It says they'll take commitments on some important things about equitable taxation of multinational corporations, efficient taxation of the world's wealthiest of high net worth individuals, of combating international tax abuse, meaning tax havens and illicit flows, and the redistribution of taxing rights between developed and developing countries, which is a huge problem. Right now, the tax system has biases against the richest against the poorest countries in favor of the richest countries. So we're really in and correcting some of the fundamental injustices in the global tax system. It's really terrific. But we also, and some of the speakers on this panel were part of that battle last year. We also wanted explicit mentioning of gender inequalities. And that we didn't get. And what was with that? There was a reaction from negotiators. They're experts on tax, and they were like, oh, this gender, it's very confusing. We don't know what it is. And then it's also that political will, that great, you started talking about tax and gender inequality. Now you need to start doing it when you make the big decisions. And the tax convention, that is a big decision. So right now, gender inequality is not explicitly mentioned, and the transformative tax systems is not explicitly mentioned. But you can't do an international tax system for sustainable development if you don't look at this. And we also have in the principles, it mentions things like human rights. You can't discuss tax and human rights without discussing gender inequalities. So we need to make sure that these high-level commitments, when they write the actual convention, we need to make sure that they really turn language into practice. And there's some very, very big things at stake. If you look at what it is that we're doing with this tax convention, right now, the world's richest corporations and individuals, they can use tax havens to avoid or evade, to dodge tax rules, and the poorest can't. And when that happens, there's a huge gender bias, because when you look at who's got the money, obviously there are more women than men. And the second consequence is that then we have public coffers that are empty because there's not enough tax money coming in because the richest aren't paying. And that undermines public services and then lands in unpaid care work where women are lifting the lion's share. And the last step is indeed then governments start taxing the poor more because it's too difficult to tax the rich. And that's when we have another bias against the women. Women are overrepresented among the poorest and also spend a higher share of their income on consumption. So when governments use consumption taxes, it impacts women more hard than men. So these are the challenges. And it's one thing to make sure that the avenue is now open and we have a place where we can negotiate it. But now we really need to remind our governments about the fact that they have already very clearly committed to addressing gender inequalities and to deliver quality public services. Now is the time to make sure that that gets integrated into the big decisions they make. And one of those decisions is the UN Tax Convention. And the last thing I'll say is that they definitely can't come back to us and say it's not clear what they should do, because there's so much amazing work that's been done on clarifying this agenda. And thank God that the Global Alliance Tax and Gender Working Group has been so active on this. There are really no excuses. It's very clear what the homework is. So I think we have some really, really good starting points, but it's going to be some busy and important years that we have ahead of us. So let's keep up the fight.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Tove, for outlining those challenges, but also giving us some hope and like showing us how far we've already come, right? But for sure, the homework is very, very clear and no more excuses. And talking about the UN Tax Convention, that also leads us really nicely to our last panelists. But before we go there, just a reminder to our attendees, please use the Q&A box to pose your questions to the panelists, because we're nearing the end of the panel, and then we can go into your questions as well. But now, last but certainly not least, I'm going to introduce Jeannie Manipon, who is co-coordinator for the Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia. And Jeannie, as I said, we can talk a little bit more about processes such as the UN Tax Convention, and it would be great to hear from you how we can ensure that the voices and experiences of women, particularly those from marginalized communities, are central in the ongoing discussions around global tax reforms, as I said, such as those related to the UN Tax Convention. Over to you, Jeannie. Thank you. Jeannie, can you hear us? There we go.
Yes.
Perfect.
Thank
Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the speakers. With that question, I would like to begin with some assertions that I believe or hope you will agree with. No? Firstly, there is no global movement for tax justice and women's rights without the warm bodies of women and the marginalized communities who have historically borne the brunt of the elite and gender biases in our flawed tax systems, and who now stand in the front lines fighting for their rights, for justice, for transformation of oppressive systems. Secondly, the fight for the UN Tax Convention is part of a long history, which I'm sure other speakers around the table are more deeply familiar with and have had more direct experience in. No? What would immediately come to mind when we talk about UN Tax Convention is the history of negotiations, the bold and persistent leadership of the leaders of the countries of the Global South, especially the Africa Group, matched by persistent and no less brilliant leadership and tacticizing of women and men in civil society who have pushed for it, some of whom are around our table right now. But the fight for the UN Tax Convention, I believe, is also part of a broader picture, of a long history and broader picture of women and men from the grassroots CSO social movements who have been fighting for tax justice and women's rights, for an end to elite and corporate biases in our tax systems, and an end to inequalities in global tax rules and rule-making. That broader picture has given birth to the situation that we have now. The hopes that we have now. Their presence and voices may not be visible inside the halls of the UN headquarters where negotiations are taking place, but there they are with their movements, raising their voices and demanding tax justice, applying pressure on their governments. And Tove emphasized political will. No, how is that political will of governments going to be forged? The political conditions on the ground need to be created in our own countries that would eventually compel governments and even mass media to give more attention and priority to the call for thoroughgoing and ambitious national and global progressive tax reforms urgently needed to make taxes work for people and the planet. Two lessons we all know as women. We know from our own experience as women fighting for our rights, if we don't ask for it, it won't be given to us on a silver platter. And for the rights of women and marginalized communities, we don't only have to ask, often we have to demand collectively. That is one historical truth we know. Secondly, if only left to the technical experts or the tax geeks or government negotiators, now radical changes like the recognition of women's rights or even the UN Tax Convention don't just happen naturally or overnight inside the negotiating halls. The political conditions need to be there, to be created. And part of those conditions are the pressures on the ground. In the Philippines, we call it the rice cake strategy. We make our rice cakes by applying heat on top and heat from below. So how do we make sure that the voices of women and marginalized communities are central in the ongoing discussions? It will not be easy, but we will keep trying. I believe there is already a very good civil society mechanism that provides a platform for making the local, national, global connections among civil society and movements, and also gathering the inputs and voices. Now, this mechanism enjoys the leadership of many women here, the leadership of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, and many women tax justice leaders. You recall the wonderful work that was put into civil society sign-on statements, hundreds of signatories, organizational signatories. TAFJA and the Tax and Fiscal Justice Asia, my organization, the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, mobilized our members for the sign-on. And our membership is largely grassroots-based. It was not just about getting their signatures online. We conducted awareness-raising activities. We tried to articulate and make the connections between their multiple fights for economic justice, for wages, for land, and the fight for a global UN tax convention. We will need to continue making such connections. We need to be able to articulate and explain about the UN tax convention, what's at stake, what's in it for women. We need to monitor the negotiations, study the text, identify the entry points, and there are many that can be most productive for linking to our demands for tax and gender justice. For example, what does ending profit shifting of corporations and allocating equitable taxing rights across countries, what would that mean for women and marginalized communities? How can they benefit for this? How can progressive taxation work towards women's rights? The UN Tax Convention, once it comes out and is completed, ultimately will be one instrument, a very important instrument among others. And depending on how and who uses it, it can deliver benefits to the marginalized sectors. But it will be a continuing journey for us. As for the ongoing negotiations, I think I have seen the inside-outside strategy employed by civil society in many global policy processes should also work. So while negotiations in New York are taking place, in our home countries, we should also be doing our work to mobilize, to call attention to what women want from a UN tax convention and how a UN tax convention can usher in radical changes that can work for women's rights. So thank you. That's it for now.
Thank you very much, Jeannie. That was a great intervention. I especially love the strategy of heat from the top and heat from below, and really using these kind of approaches and insider-outsider strategies as well to push for the changes that we all want to see. Thank you very much. As I said, we can now move into the Q&A. We have a little bit of time. Please continue to use the Q&A box as well for your questions. I see that we have a few in there already, so I would invite all of our panelists to come back and join me and turn your video on if you can, so we can look at the questions together. Unfortunately, because we're using the webinar functionality, we can't have people come in and ask their questions themselves, but I'm gonna try my best and do justice to your questions and read them out. So thank you for those who have submitted questions already. Please continue to do so. The first one was from Abigail, who had a comment saying, women, including women migrant workers, bear an unequal share of unpaid care work that limits their access to employment. Many women migrant workers are placed in vulnerable situations where access to financial services, for example, access to having a bank account, is restricted, further deepening the financial barriers they face. There wasn't a question here, but perhaps the panel would like to talk a little bit more about the intersectionalities of care workers, especially, for example, migrant workers as well, and some of the experience that you might have made with this topic and would like to share with attendees. So let's start with that question, and then we can go to the next ones. Who would like to come in on this one?
Yeah, I think maybe just briefly, I think that particular question from Abigail is one that I think hits quite close to home, largely because I think some of the people on the call, I think you might know that I'm from Zimbabwe. And because of the economic situation there, we've seen a huge number of men and women, but I think in the situation we're talking about women specifically, because of their largely vulnerable status, having to immigrate in order to find more financial livelihood options. And this absolutely makes their situation incredibly more vulnerable, right? Particularly when they are crossing from one country to the next and finding themselves in a situation where they know nobody, but also have a very precarious legal status, right, in those countries. And so absolutely, I think women that find themselves at that intersection are women that we need to be thinking much more thoughtfully about in terms of how we most support them, because I think they're significantly more vulnerable than women that, you know, might be still in their home countries in that situation.
Thank you so much, Chenai. And Magdalena, I see you also have your hand up. Please, over to you. Oh, you're on mute. Can you just unmute?
Thank you. I would like to emphasize the point that Chenai was doing. And I think that it is very important to see that when we're talking about the unequal distribution of unpaid care work, this is very much related with migration patterns. So what is happening is that women from the global south are the ones that are being migrating to the global north to provide care work, and they're migrants and they're in very precarious situation, actually leaving their own families behind without the support, the care support that they were supposed to provide. So they go to the north to provide and satisfy a care need, but they leave their own countries with an increased demand for care. But this is also internal migration. So in big cities, in the global north and the global south, what is happening is that women from rural areas, in most cases, women that are, for example, from minorities or indigenous and ethnic minority backgrounds, are the one going to the cities to provide the care needs. So migration within the country and through borders, it is really at the core when we talk about the needs to protect care workers by recognizing, valuing, and redistributing care work. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. Jeannie, over to you.
Thank you. Very quickly, I agree with what has been said, and I'm very thankful that this point was made, because what we're really facing now is a global crisis of care, and it's a crisis of, it's a chain of a crisis. So, migration, there's also the problem of families left behind. So bringing back the point that Klelia made, universal access to social protection should include care workers, whether they're citizens of the countries or not, whether they are documented or undocumented workers. So I think that's a very important point that everyone has spoken about. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you very much, Jeannie. And over to Klelia on this one, and then we can move to the next question. Thank you.
Yeah, just a very curious point, I would say. When we had the pandemic, there were lots of studies, trying to understand which the impact was of the whole situation. And even though this crisis, this migration crisis we are having now, especially in Latin America as well, because of Venezuela and also what is happening in the US now, what the usual response that we have from the public sector, to say it, is that we have not identified who these people are, or how can we help them. Well, that is the call that the governments have to, to respond to, because it's their position to look for these people and for these groups that are in conditions that probably even limit their not only their access to the services per se, but also even to the places, or to just to the information. Probably even the services are there, but sometimes it is also necessary that the public service kind of has an approach that reaches them, and this has to be done actively, not just as it has been done in several situations, more kind of passively. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Klelia, and thanks all for coming back on this question, and thank you to Abigail for asking it and bringing it up. Very, very important point. And if we can move to the next question, thank you, Rafaela, for asking it. So this is a question about the UN Tax Convention. How are you all perceiving the UN Tax Convention? Do you think they're moving into the right direction? What are the highlights in your opinion? And is it possible for the convention to end up as the Pandemic Accord, all work and no results? And also a follow-up just to say this is not a lack of faith in CSO power to mobilize and demand, but the recognition of our international monetary and financial system structures and how these can stop a truly revolutionary UN tax convention. Definitely. Thank you, Rafaela, for asking it. And I don't think any of us would take the question in bad faith. So thank you for asking. And yeah, I'll open it up to our panel. Who would like to come in first on this question? Tove, please go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, definitely. No bad faith, but it's very important that we keep asking ourselves the tough questions. And we have a very good feeling about the UN Tax Convention, both when it comes to the terms of reference, the mandate, it ended up better than we had dared hope. And it both has to do with the objective. It's a very healthy objective. We're finally linking tax to sustainable development. At the same time, there's a recognition that tax systems should be equitable and decision-making should be inclusive and fair and transparent. Some of the things that we've been pushing for, we finally now have a document that states what should be obvious, but we have unfortunately 100 years of decision-making on global tax rules that has been none of those things. So that's the first step. And the terms of reference also has the fact that we have very healthy principles about linking tax to human rights, environment, social elements of sustainable development. There are very, very good things in there. We were very afraid we were going to lose what's paragraph 10 in the terms of reference, which is about commitments. We want governments to come to the UN Tax Convention negotiations and be ready to commit to changing things. And we left with a paragraph that's very strong on commitment. So it says that in the tax convention, they will commit on things like equitable taxation of multinational corporations, efficient taxation of high net worth individuals, on taking action on illicit financial flows, tax havens and international tax abuse, on linking tax systems to sustainable development. So we have something to work with, that is for sure. Can this train fall off the tracks? The pandemic discussions is one out of many examples of international negotiations that either temporarily or permanently fall off the tracks. Yes, this can happen. This is not a job done, and we have a lot of work to do on pushing this forward. This convention is not going to write itself, or if it does, and if civil society is not there, the chance that it's going to be the kind of document we want to see is close to zero. But there are some things speaking in our favor. The first one is that this convention really makes sense. Nobody's saying we shouldn't have global tax rules. There are just some countries that want to dominate the writing of global tax rules and exclude others. But everyone, also business, acknowledged that if we have just a complete chaos on taxation, if all countries just do their own thing, no one wants to see that. And it's a good starting point that there is agreement that there should be global tax rules, which then also makes it easier to say, okay, since we will be writing global tax rules, there has to be an accountability and fairness element. So we're not suggesting doing something new, we're suggesting doing something fair, which hasn't happened for the last 100 years. And then the fact that it's a fact that tax havens are actually undermining tax system all around the world. So we have governments in the global north and global south that are losing out because of this problem. And that's a great starting point, that's a place where we can argue for having a big coalition of countries that are tired of getting ripped off. But that said, there are also real battles about how should the tax income be divided between the global north and south, and also on the issue of how tax money should be spent. Here, civil society is also calling for more government accountability on not the details, but on the broad strokes on spending. And here we might see governments push back because they're happy to get the money, but they don't want us to interfere on how it's spent. So there are some very strong and important battles coming up. Right now, we're moving faster than we had dared hope, and the outcomes are looking better than we had dared hope. That might not continue, but it is generally looking good. It's going to be a tough battle, and we can have some points where we hit the wall, where the negotiations, for one way, reason or the other, run into different types of crisis. We've seen that in many other instances. But if we do, or maybe we should say when we do, I think it's important that we don't talk about, oh, the UN negotiations have failed. No, the governments have failed. This is the thing, every time we have a multilateral process that goes wrong, it's just like when you flunk an exam, you can't blame the exam or the room, it was you who didn't manage. So we should hold governments to account, and we have such a strong case.
Great. Thank you very much, Tove, for that. Would anybody else like to come in on the question around the UN Tax Convention just briefly? I'm just looking at the time, but I want to give the chance to others as well to respond to this question. Magdalena, please go ahead. If you could keep it brief as well, just so we can do some closing.
I will
Thank
try.
you.
I do believe, like Tove, that this has gone extremely well. I tend to see the bottle half empty, or the glass half empty, with everything that is happening in the world. So the way in which this has progressed, it is really one of the very, very few examples in which multilateralism is working right now. Now, the question is, can this change? Yes, of course. I mean, we have seen since the new US administration huge changes to things that we thought would have never been discussed again. 2 days ago, they start criticizing the SDGs, and so we're halfway to the deadline of the SDGs that we're not complying with anyway, but it was like a global agreement, and now they're challenging. So things might go wrong, but if we have to choose the one example in which multilateralism is working, this is the case.
Thank you so much, Magdalena. Any last comments on the UN Tax Convention? Okay, then I see there's also a question in the chat in French. If someone could get back to that question in the chat, that would be really great. It's about if many African countries have signed on to these conventions of the United Nations. And I would relay that to Tove and Chenai and Magdalena and others who are experts and will know more. So if you could get back to that in the chat, that would be really great. But thank you everybody so much for asking your questions. In the interest of time, we're now going to move to the closing remarks and hear from all of our panelists for a second time again with the question, what are your expectations for the impact of these global days of actions to raise the hashtag Make Taxes Work for Women call in your region as well as globally? And how are you hoping that people in your region will engage? And if we can keep it brief in the interest of time, and maybe we can start in reverse order this time. So Jeannie, could I start with you, please?
Thank you very much, Yamina. This is now 10 p.m. in the Philippines. In many parts of Asia, it's evening, and I'm imagining many women now are already folding their streamers, ready to march tomorrow. And I believe some of our members have already registered their activities for the Global Days of Action. I sense that while the situation, the economic situation, the situation of injustice are so great and so deep, we talk of a post-pandemic situation, but in fact, the multiple crisis impacts continue, but there is a very strong fighting spirit among women's groups where I come from in the region. So I think we hope to see their energies as part of the Global Days of Action. And we hope we can support them and also amplify their voices. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Jeannie. And we really always appreciate people joining from different time zones, and that will always mean that someone has to stay up late and get up early. So thank you so much. And I'll hand to Tove now for a brief concluding remarks on the same question. Thank you.
Yes, and also the question on the African countries. I'm sure Chenai can say more, but the African countries have been the huge champions on this. It's really, the leadership has been amazing. And that brings me to the answer to the second question, what should happen in our regions? The Europeans definitely haven't. First, the European countries voted no, and the best they could do now, they voted abstain. So what should we see in Europe on the International Women's Day and tax? Let's not be satisfied with all the nice words about how the European governments are supportive of gender equality. Now it's time to deliver, including in the UN Tax Convention, and we should demand that they literally walk the talk.
Definitely. Thank you, Tove. Walk the talk and do their homework. Over to you, Chenai, for your concluding remarks with the same question as well.
Sure, thanks, Yamina. So I think just very briefly to respond to the question in the chat, as Tove said, this process is being led by the Africa Group, and it's really incredible to see the way in which African countries have united to lead this kind of process. It's not often, right, that we see a Global South region leading such a transformational conversational. So I think in response to the question, we are absolutely seeing African governments coming up to lead on this work and align collectively with regards to its objectives. I think with regards to the work happening in the region, I think the Global Days of Action and this month as a whole is really a moment for reflection for I think specifically to this conversation, women that are working within tax. In fact, right now I'm at a conference that's brought together tax administrators, civil society organizations, various women that are involved within sort of tax conversations from various perspectives. And I think one of the things that is clear and is a clarion call from this conversation is we need to see the intersection between tax and gender equality made much more pronounced. We need to see women's voices centered within tax conversations, and we need to create the kinds of environments that allow for women to participate much more meaningfully within the labor market. So I think for us, that's what the Global Days of Action and this month broadly means, and I think is really showing a positive direction for this kind of work.
Thank you very much, Chenai. And over to you, Klelia.
Thank you, Yamina. Well, I think I always want like to kind of close this kind of interactions with three takeaways that kind of remind me of why I'm here for. And the first of all, I think, is adaptability. And it's for me a celebration of how the feminist movement and the fiscal movement and all the movements that have been interacting in this conversation, but in the whole, mobilization on tax and gender, have been able to adapt and share share our points in every conversation, in every scenario, and I think that is something to celebrate. And I would like to have that point as the first. The second will be something that I have been telling myself, I think, since probably maybe 2 years ago. I started with this idea of, well, let's start proposing solutions, in the sense that, yeah, we know that GDP is not the best of measures, but how many times we have devoted time and effort to actually kind of explore alternatives. And yes, so some people do have the chance to do it, or the knowledge, or the skills, but also when we do not, just being curious about it, posing questions, and kind of looking for spaces in which this is being done, is also helpful for that to happen. So I would like to share that with you as well. Like, let's focus on developing alternatives, on trying alternatives, because what we have now is what we have had for, the whole history, probably. And it's to start to devote more energy and intention in what we want to have. And then in terms of closing as well, the third point would be, let's be generous, but let's be open, not only with those that are, in our inner circle, doing the same work as we do, but also with those that have a different perspective and maybe oppose our opinions, and also with those that want to be involved but do not know how, or have not been working on this before, because that is the only way in which we can be contagious about what we're trying to mobilize. That would be it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Klelia. Definitely broadening the movement and bringing those along that might not want to be brought along, and bringing them in as well. And last but not least, Magdalena, over to you for your concluding remarks as well. And I know we're up against time, so thanks everyone. If you can join us for just a couple more minutes. Over to you, Magdalena.
Today, worldwide, there is a huge pushback on gender equality that is very well organized and funded by far right movements. So now, more than ever, women and feminist allies, we need to stand together. And this is a good example. We need to bridge our disciplinary silos. We need to work together, and we need to be comprehensive in our demands. So tax justice and gender justice are have a very close and direct cause and consequences. So it is now when we need to hold together, because if women's and feminist rights organizations are pushed back, that is also a very strong pushback on our democracies, on our progressive policies. So what I expect now is that this should be the beginning of a much closer and strengthened collaboration between different allies to hold back, to resist, and push forward for rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Magdalena, for this very important reminder and call at the end of this panel. And thank you so much to all of our amazing panelists for your time, for your expertise, for your insights, for sharing your hopes and challenges and demands with us today. Much appreciated. And yeah, now I'm just going to hand over to Maureen for some closing remarks, and to also share some guidance on how everybody can get involved with this amazing campaign this year. Thank you so much, everyone.
Oh, wow, that was Quite nice. Thank you so much to our esteemed panel. Thank you for creating the time and for taking us through in detail those various concepts, and I'm sure the audience has truly appreciated it. Thank you as well to the audience for staying with us all through, and right now we're 3 minutes past our time, but thank you so much as well for just being present and also for their questions. So quickly, in terms of next steps, just in the interest of time, so as we mentioned when we were starting, this is just the launch of the campaign. So the work does not stop here. This is when the work has actually begun. So we have a series of planned events that will be happening over the next course of days until the 21st of March, which is when we come to the conclusion of this particular Global Days of Action campaign. We urge you, as our audience, we urge you wherever you are, to please take part in our global actions. And then, of course, we have our program, which will be dropped into the chat right now by Alex. So please look into the chat. You can see that we have an array of activities within our program, but then in brief, and especially highlighting the global actions that will be taking place. Tomorrow, as we all know, is International Women's Day. And the theme for tomorrow is Accelerate Action. So we are urging all of us, just because maybe not all of us will be working tomorrow, but please engage in a very active social media campaign. Please take photos of yourself. If your country, you're having some marches, please join the marches that are calling for women's rights, whether they're on the street, whether they're at home, whether the marches are on the street or wherever they are, please join. Of course, be safe, but please join the marches. If you're at home, we're also encouraging you to please just take a photo holding a banner with the campaign hashtag for the Global Days of Action, which is Make Taxes Work for Women, and hashtag Progressive Tax for Care, as well as with the main rallying call for the International Women's Day, which is Accelerate Action. After that, on the 12th of March 2025, there will be the UNCSW parallel event that will be led by the Rebuilding Social Organization of Care core group. So this will be happening at 2:30 p.m. Central European Time, or 4:30 p.m. EAT. So as well, please join on that one. The details of all these particular activities are embedded within our website, so please also look through. On the 14th of March as well, we will have a further deep dive into Agenda Transformative UN Tax Convention and what this exactly looks like and what we'd hope this would look like. So this is an activity that will be co-organized by GAJE together with our regional partners. We'll have TJNA, we'll have Justicia, Fiscal, and then we'll have TJE and Eurodad. So please as well join. It will be happening at 2 p.m. CET. On the 19th of March as well, we'll be having a webinar where we'll just be taking stock of tax justice for women, 30 years since now the Beijing Declaration, which we all know is the theme for this year's UNCSW. So this activity as well will be co-organized by GAJE together with Femnet and Akina Mama Africa, happening at the same time, 2 p.m. CET time. And then on the 21st of March, we'll be having our closing webinar, same time. For all these global actions and these global activities, the webinars interpretation will be available. So please join. Please tell a friend to also tell a friend. In addition to this as well, we have various other several campaign activities that will be run by our colleagues within the Tax and Gender Working Group, and the details are available in the program, in the campaign program that is within our website. So please look through. For the in-person engagements, if it is happening within your country or within your area, please just join in. Please also feel free to join the webinars as well. Lastly, we are asking you as well to join our social media campaign, and specifically from Monday next week till Friday, we shall be focusing on a campaign demand on each particular day. As you may have noticed when we were doing the welcoming remarks, we have 5 key campaign demands. So each particular day for next week, we set aside to handle a particular demand. So we will do this through the social media platforms, and we'll share blogs that have been done by our partners and by our our members, as well as clips on each demand, and just generally have a very detailed and engaging social media advocacy. So we're urging you to please join the conversation as well online, post on your various platforms, share the visuals, reshare our posts, tell people who do not know maybe about it, and explain to them as well the significance. Let's have as many of us joining in this particular Global Days of Action initiative. As we said, it's not just a campaign, it is our call to action, and our call to action can only be achieved if we collectively take part in it. And then, of course, lastly, we have developed a campaign toolkit, and this is available upon request. So if you would like to get a copy, you can please reach us by sending an email to either info@gaje or to Alexandra. She's going to drop as well the email address on the chat, and you can be able to engage and share with us on that one. So thank you so much, and I believe we've come now to the end of the launch event, and we are also excited. So let's continue with this messaging. Let it not end here. Let this be the start of very fruitful engagements moving forward. So asanteni sana, and I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day or night, depending on your time zone. Bye-bye.